Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the Hepatitis B Foundation and our Hepatitis Delta Connect program, I want to thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Sierra Palecchio, and I am the program coordinator of the Hepatitis Delta Connect program here at the Hepatitis B Foundation. We're very excited to present today's session on prevalence of hepatitis delta virus infection in the United States. And our expert speaker here today is Dr. Eduardo Martins. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's webinar. Please note that all attendees are in listen-only mode and will be muted during the presentations. There is also a phone-in option, and the call-in numbers are right here on the screen. You may submit your questions in writing during the presentation by typing them in the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We will be reviewing them as they come in, and we'll hold a Q&A period after the presentations have finished. And finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with a link to view a recording of today's presentation after the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Eduardo Martins, the Senior Vice President of Liver and Infectious Diseases at Eiger Biopharmaceuticals. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Martins.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you all for dialing in. My objective today is to share with you a bit of research that we did, trying to add some more data to shed light on the prevalence of hepatitis delta infection in the U.S. These data were presented a few weeks, last month, sorry, in Chicago. So, okay, first my disclosures. I am an employee and shareholder at Eiger Biopharmaceuticals, and we are developing medications for hepatitis delta. So today I want to go through a little bit of a background on the disease itself, global prevalence, and some key U.S. data to then serve as a launching pad to the prevalence study that we conducted. And I hope that I will be able to share some new information with you. So hepatitis delta is the most severe form of chronic viral hepatitis. It is very fast progressive disease. It leads to cirrhosis about half the time as hepatitis B would do the same, and it's 5 to 7 more times more likely to go to cirrhosis compared to HBV. The virus is a defective virus, quite unique. It's a very small virus, and it needs hepatitis B for propagation. So the delta virus effectively hijacks the hepatitis B, the hepatitis B virus itself, and uses the surface antigen to make its own envelope. Then it can be secreted from the hepatocytes, and more importantly, attach and infect previously uninfected hepatocytes. So as you know, the hepatitis delta cannot exist without the background of chronic hepatitis B. An interesting aspect is that usually the viral load for hepatitis B is very low or undetectable in patients that have co-infection with delta, who also happen to be, more often than not, E antigen negative. There is no approved treatment for delta neither by FDA nor any other regulatory agencies worldwide, but there is some benefit if one uses pegylated interferon alpha. Modest benefit, early responses about 25%, but recent data show that relapses over time are common and more needs to be done. The prevalence is about 15 to 20 million people worldwide. It is, however, an orphan disease in the United States and in Europe based on the definitions. And in our country, it is any disease that has less than 200,000 patients. This would be your definition of orphan disease in the US. So it is a common disease in the world, not as much in the US and in Europe. But nonetheless, it's not a negligible disease. About 4 to 6% of the hepatitis B population is infected with Delta. And over the next few slides, I will share with you some data that suggests there may be more Delta in the United States than we believe. So Delta happens around the globe, but there are some areas that tend to have a higher prevalence than others, and those are indicated in black here. From left to right, the Amazon basin in Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela has a very high prevalence. Over 60% of the patients with hepatitis B have Delta. In Africa, the data are limited. We do not get good epidemiological information for many countries, but nonetheless, you have prevalences ranging from very low in South Africa to very, very high in some other places. Delta is also prevalent in some countries in the Middle East, in particular Iran. In Europe, Romania is a hotspot, most likely associated with medical practices in the old Ceausescu days. Hepatitis B is also highly prevalent in Romania. The prevalence in the former Eastern European countries, around former Eastern European communist countries around Romania, is not as well established, but we do know that Moldova and Bulgaria have a high prevalence that needs to be better investigated. Pakistan, another country where over 60% of the patients with hepatitis B can have Delta, and finally in Central Asia, Mongolia, where about 60% of the patients infected with hepatitis B have hepatitis Delta as well. And of course, we live in a global world. So patients do move from country to country every day, a large number of people moving from country to country, and amongst those, people who are infected with chronic hepatitis Delta. So we need to assume that many of those patients are already in the United States or will be in the United States in any time in the near future. So the nature of diseases worldwide, and this is not just for chronic viral hepatitis, is changing on a regular basis based on epidemiological parameters associated with migration patterns. The slide that I'm presenting here is a courtesy of Dr. Robert Gish. And basically, a couple of months ago, he presented at the same webinar a very nice introduction to hepatitis Delta treatment and characteristics of the disease. And I borrowed this information. And what I want to show you are two things. One, the chart at the top that shows that not only in the United States, but across countries in Europe, and those are the top 5 countries in Europe as far as epidemiology for hepatitis B goes, the proportion of patients that are estimated to have Delta is actually much higher than the proportion of patients that have already been diagnosed with hepatitis Delta. So even in places such as Italy, where the virus was described, the actual diagnosis rate is very, very low. So if we move to the US, the estimates for hepatitis B do vary. And it can be as high as 2 million patients. However, most recent data from the CDC in the post-vaccination era suggests that the number may be about half that figure. Wherever it is, it's somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, which would then give us the 118,000 potential patients infected with hepatitis delta, 33,000 of which may have been diagnosed. And I say may have because the data that we have analyzed show some slightly different figures, although our overall estimate is not too dissimilar. So why did I speak so much about migration patterns in countries where we have a high prevalence? I did so because of a pivotal paper published by Chris Cowdley and collaborators in Hepatology in 2012, looking at hepatitis B in foreign-born persons in the United States. And basically, they started by stating that the estimates for Hep B, they do vary significantly. And this is the same for Delta. And you saw on the slide by Bob Gish on my previous screen. And what did Chris Cowdley and his colleagues did? They did a systematic review of seroprevalence of surface antigen in 102 countries. And these analyses were based on 256 seroprevalence surveys in immigrants from 52 different countries. So a staggering number of 689,000 patients in those surveys. And in addition, they also look at 1,800 surveys in general populations of 98 countries, comprising a total of 17.8 million people. So this was a very comprehensive analysis. And then they determined the country-specific hepatitis B prevalence rates. With that, they calculated rates in the US by looking at the number of foreign-born people living in our country by country of birth. So you know the prevalence in the original country. You know how many people are estimated to live in the US from different parts of the world. With those two figures, then you can estimate the prevalence in the foreign-born. And what they showed was that about half the patients, half the estimate of hepatitis B in the US, perhaps even more than that, are foreign-born. So in their figures, 1.32 million people may be infected with hepatitis B, and those are people born outside of the US. The large majority, 60%, migrated from Asia, about 11% from Africa, and 7% from Central and South America. So in summary, what this work shows us is that country of origin is an important parameter to start screening patients for chronic hepatitis B. So now let me shift to Delta. And this is work that Nora Tarot and collaborators and the first authors, Kushner, published in Journal of Hepatology in 2015, looking at Delta in the VA. And the VA is an important place to look for Delta because patients in that population, there is a high rate of intravenous drug use. They happen to be baby boomers and a number of other characteristics. And IV drug use is a risk factor for having hepatitis delta. So the VA has a phenomenal electronic database of patients. So the physicians in the system can run epidemiological analysis in a very easy way. However, it's still a lot of work, but having the electronic records for everybody at your hands help a lot. And they analyzed for this particular work all patients positive for surface antigen between late 99 to late 2013. They found 25,000 patients that were positive for hepatitis B surface antigen. And of those, only 8.5% were tested for Delta, and 73 of those, or 3.4%, tested positive. So, not surprisingly, testing for HDV for Delta was associated with being tested for hepatitis B, HIV, and HCV. Patients that have hepatitis B co-infection with either HIV or HCV are also at a higher rate of hepatitis delta. The risk factors are similar. So in the VA system, they are keeping an eye on patients that have risk factors associated with those three diseases. But nonetheless, the rate of testing is still very, very low. What were the predictors of positive Delta tests? Substance abuse, we talked about this, and liver cirrhosis. The other and very important predictor was abnormal ALT in patients with suppressed HBV DNA. This is a red flag for Delta, because usually the titers of Hep B are very low or completely undetectable in patients with Delta, and we mentioned that briefly earlier on in the presentation. So things to be aware of: patients that have a history of substance abuse, in particular patients who inject intravenous drugs, abnormal ALT with low or undetectable HBV DNA in a patient who is surface antigen positive. So Delta in the VA was as bad as Delta elsewhere. HCC was 2.9 times more common in Delta patients than in the hepatitis B population. And Delta was independently associated with HCC in this particular study. So let me now discuss another study looking at prevalence of hepatitis delta in another system where electronic medical records are very, very good. And this is work that Bob Gish did at California Pacific Medical Center and published in Journal of Gastroenterology and Hepatology back in 2013. So they did chart reviews, and they found in their records 1,200 patients that had hepatitis B. Of those, 500, or a little under 50%, were tested for Delta. 8% of those patients, or 42, were co-infected, and importantly, half of those were also hepatitis C infected. So these were patients that had hepatitis B, hepatitis delta, and hepatitis C. The most common population to have infection concomitantly with the tree virus would be people who inject drugs. The rate of cirrhosis was very, very high, 73% in the delta co-infected, getting even higher when hepatitis C was added, going to 80%, compared to 22% in HBV monoinfection. So again, demonstrating the very serious nature of the disease. The patients that they saw were mostly Caucasian non-Hispanics, and they had 24% Asians or Pacific Islanders. So those data combined suggest that, as in hepatitis B, Delta is likely to be more prevalent in foreign-born. Testing for hepatitis Delta is suboptimal in spite of the disease being more aggressive than hepatitis B monoinfection. So let me walk you through the work that we did. And it was preliminary analysis, and what we tried to do was to look at an ICD-10 codes across 2 large databases in the United States and try to identify some numbers and patterns of testing. So let me walk you through the work that we did. So we looked at, I said ICD-10, but of course the data that we had to analyze also comprised a number of years where ICD-9 was the version that we used. So we did apply the translation, if you will, from 9 to 10. And we tried to look at codes for patients with Delta B co-infection in those 2 longitudinal databases. The first database was the TruVan Market Scan, and this database contains medical claims information for over 170 million people in the United States. Of course, it's very important to say that in all the databases that we use, the patient data are de-identified to be completely HIPAA compliant. The second analysis, which was more detailed, used the Symphony Integrated Universe Patient Source Database. So this is another longitudinal database that when all things are added up, you have over 4 billion prescriptions, medical and hospital claims, again linked to anonymous patient identifiers, practitioners, and payers. So it is a very large amount of information. The claims information were available for over 274 million people in the population of 330 million that roughly is what we have in the US today. So this accounts for over 73% of all prescriptions and close to 60% of all electronic processed medical claims and about a quarter of all hospital claims. And 75% in this de-identified database are linked to a prescription or a diagnostic claim. And importantly, we tried our best to avoid counting a patient multiple times. So a unique patient is counted only once in this analysis. We tried to avoid replication of the same individual. So this presentation will be up on the website, so I'm not going to walk you through all the details, but these were the ICD-10 and equivalent ICD-9 codes that we use for hepatitis B and for hepatitis Delta. So the first thing we found was that between the year 2008 and 2016, and this was the time period that we analyzed, the number of patients with HDV being diagnosed has increased, hitting 9,000 patients in 2016. And this is a 22% increase over 2015 alone. And between 2008 and 2016, we have, if you add up all the columns, 53,000 patients newly diagnosed with Delta in the US. Remember the figure from the estimates that Bob Gish presented was about 33,000. So different analysis, different evaluations of prevalence, but numbers, there are actually not too different as far as patients already diagnosed with Delta. And nice to see that the number of patients diagnosed is increasing. It doesn't mean that the Delta is increasing. it means that we are diagnosing more patients. We cannot, with this particular analysis, say that there are more and more people with Delta in the United States year after year. All we can say is that more are being diagnosed. So what we compare in this slide is in the columns, the number of patients newly diagnosed with chronic hepatitis B. So these are shown in the pinkish bars. The line shows the percentage of patients with chronic hepatitis B that have hepatitis delta. And what this slide tells us is that the incidence of the co-infection appears higher than what was estimated below. And between 2013 and 2016, more than doubled. Again, not entirely sure why. I do believe more patients are being diagnosed, but nonetheless, the proportion of patients with chronic hepatitis B that are newly diagnosed that also have hepatitis delta has increased markedly. For instance, in 2016, about 50,000 unique patients were newly diagnosed with B, and 11.8%, or 6,600 of those, were diagnosed as having B co-infection with Delta. And these data are consistent in both the TruVen and the SHS databases. So now I'm going to stretch and speculate. If we apply this rate of co-infection, 11.8%, and assume that it has remained steady over time, and this is an assumption, I do not have data to indicate that this is the case, the number of Delta patients in the US may be around 110,000 patients. Again, not too far from the figure that Bob just showed, which was 118,000. So our data suggest that the numbers that we find using those electronic data sets is similar to the numbers that were derived from previous NHANES survey. Trying to move to the next slide. Okay, so what do these data tell us? Well, the footprint of Delta is actually growing in the US. Sorry, my pointer just had a, okay. So, and with this database, we can analyze, as I said, where the patients are. And how do we know that without identifying the individuals? The databases give us the top 3 digits of the zip codes. So let's say my zip code here is 94404. If I were part of this particular analysis, the 944 would be the way to identify the geographic area where I live. And 25% of the hepatitis delta patients that we identify reside in a small number of places, the majority of them in New York and in Chicago. And I'm going to go over that in a few more details in a couple of slides. If we look at the top 20 3-digit zip codes that I mentioned you, that comprises almost half the patients with Delta in the US. So about 20 cities alone have half of the patients with hepatitis Delta in the US. And where are these patients? Well, as I said, they are spread in different places. They are mostly in New York, but Chicago actually has a very high prevalence, and I have a map that I will show you in a moment that will give you a better geographic idea of where the patients are. But if you look at those top 20, the The majority of the patients are concentrated on the East Coast, in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, and the upper northeast. In the Midwest, the upper Midwest represents the majority, and those patients are in Chicago and surrounding cities. So, what are the consistent areas of patient concentration? Between 2008 and 2014, if we were to look at the top 20 geographies and places that came up more than 4 times within these years, these are the cities. Some of you may practice in one of those, but again, you can see the preponderance of cities in the upper northeast. Pittsburgh, California, which is a suburb of San Francisco, not Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but Philadelphia is also highly represented. Now, if we look at the same type of data, but in a different way, let's look at patients that, the geographies that appeared more than twice between 2013 and 16 that were not included in the list on the left. So this will tell us where are the places where more patients with Delta are being diagnosed. Well, here Chicago comes into play, and I showed you that in the bar chart in the previous slide. Other areas in Illinois, Berlin, for example, Waukegan, Illinois. Florida comes up. Miami, Hialeah is a suburb of Miami. Orlando, an area of big inflow of people. Orlando has grown dramatically. If you've been to Disney World 2 decades ago and now, you can see the size of the city around. And Hampstead, New York. So let's look at those figures and make them visual. Let's look at the map. What does it look like? And I hope my mouse is working as a pointer. In 2008, the upper northeast, in particular the New York area, represented the bulk of the patients. And we can see here in the heat map in red. Please note that the margins of each color are a bit blurred. And this is because we can only see the top 3 digits of the zip codes, again, to try and preserve patient privacy, especially for individuals that live in a place, let's say here in New Mexico. This may represent perhaps 1 or 2 patients, and we have to make sure that we don't know exactly where they live. So in 2008, the upper northeast, the San Francisco Bay Area, Southern California were big areas. You had Dallas and Houston, again appearing a little bit. Chicago was always an area where Delta existed, and also here in the Ohio, Michigan area. I want to bring your attention, not as many cases in the area Ohio, Kentucky, and surroundings. And again, Florida, we talked about Gainesville, Orlando, and we talked about Miami. So now, how does that look in 2016, the last year of our survey? Well, the upper northeast, New York, all the way down to DC area, continues to represent the large area, the large bulk of the population. However, if you look at Chicago and surrounding cities, the heat map has grown considerably. If you look at the size of the red dot here compared to the red dot in 2008, you can see the increase of cases of hepatitis Delta. San Francisco Bay Area, Southern California remain relatively stable. We do see an increase in Houston. Houston has a high Vietnamese population. We do not know for a fact that the patients with Delta are from Vietnam, but patients from Vietnam have a very high prevalence of hepatitis B. In San Francisco, we have a number of different Asian populations, including Mongolians. If we go, of course, upper northeast in Chicago, is the melting pot of America. You have people from all over the world, all ethnicities that are originating from places where hepatitis delta may be highly prevalent. So certain countries in Eastern Europe, certain countries in Asia, in the New York area, African countries represented as well. Come to Florida, we need to understand a little bit better. Orlando grew a lot, so we need to understand from other studies, and this is the next thing we want to do, is to try to superimpose those figures with the census figures and see if we can have an idea of the potentially high number of people in a given ethnicity in a given area that might give us a hint of potential patients with Delta that could help with future screening. Not 100% sure about Miami. Again, a city that has grown dramatically, Miami and surroundings. It could also be because of Dr. Gene Schiff, living giant in hepatology, and the University of Miami Liver Center. It is very conceivable that his presence and his colleagues attract a number of people from different parts of the world that then establish residence in Miami. I'm just speculating here, just given the importance of the one person for hepatology as a whole. Well, like any study, our analysis also has limitations, and it would be incomplete if I would not share with you my assessment of those. So, although the databases capture a large number of patients, mostly those are insurance patients. However, those years encompass a large number of years where Medicaid was expended. So I think we have a reasonably representative population, but nonetheless, there are a high number of people that are probably not included. And if we consider that hepatitis B is much more prevalent in the foreign-born, and many of those populations may have concerns about being in the healthcare system, sometimes undocumented, we may be missing some of those patients. Ethnicity is not captured in this study, as I mentioned before, and we're going to try to see what we can do about that. I mentioned the foreign-born, and I cannot emphasize that enough. We cannot diagnose Delta without diagnosing B. And awareness of where the patients with B come is very important when you go out back to your practices and you are educating your junior colleagues and other physicians, emphasizing the importance of testing the foreign-born for chronic hepatitis B. And this is very much what the USPSTF recommended back in 2014. They do list all the countries, but suffice to say, if one assumes that any person who is foreign-born should be tested, you are very much in line with the USPSTF recommendation. And of course, if somebody identifies a patient with B and that patient has risk factors, Delta should be high on the list for testing. Ideally, everybody who has B should be tested for Delta, but this is not feasible. So again, remember, cirrhosis, triple infection, be it with HCV or HIV, IV drug use, or other types of substance abuse. Those are the patients that we have to be thinking about Delta all the time. Another limitation of our survey is that it's based on anti-Delta antibody. And some patients may be antibody positive, but not PCR positive, indicating pre-existing infection that is, at least for the time being, on remission. So we would have missed some of those. And again, I bring Miami as my speculative example. Tertiary centers may have a disproportionate impact of on the distribution of patients. So two things to bear in mind. It could be the ethnicity of an individual in a specific community, and it could also be proximity to a tertiary center. Whichever way it is, the heat map shows us where the patients are likely to be found. And finally, again, our testing is of antibody. An antibody, as I mentioned before, does not differentiate between current, ongoing, and past infection. So to conclude, it's possible that more than 11% of the patients with Hep B may be infected with Delta. At least this is the case for the newly diagnosed hepatitis B patients. However, the testing for Delta is woefully inadequate. Even though the number of tests requested has increased a lot, the number of newly diagnosed patients with B being tested for Delta has increased a lot. Only about 5% are tested. And if you think about patients with hepatitis B that may fulfill one of the risk factors for having Delta, you can easily see that we are under-testing our patients. Nonetheless, just a tiny increase in the testing rate, as I showed you before, yielded significant increases in the detection of co-infected patients. And this cannot be emphasized enough. So even small steps are equivalent to great leaps when we're talking about this disease. Geography. Being aware of the footprint of Delta help those who are in practice to think about testing if they see a hepatitis B patient and if they have a newly diagnosed hepatitis B patient, in particular those with suppressed or undetectable HBV DNA, and in spite of that have elevated liver enzymes. And finally, we need to test more. Testing is available through commercial labs in the US, and the CDC offers a PCR test for Delta as well. So it can be done. Many other labs most labs will have Delta antigen. There is at least one lab in Salt Lake City that has PCR for Delta, and the CDC offers PCR for Delta as well. So it's easily available and can easily be done. With that said, I want to thank you very much for attending the seminar. I hope the data will be useful, and I'll pass it back to Sierra and open for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eduardo. So now we're going to turn it over for the Q&A portion. So if everyone could please submit any questions that they do have into the chat box now. We'll just wait a few minutes for those to come in. So I'll go ahead and read the first question that we have. Can you speak a little bit more about the pegylated interferon alpha treatment? Does everyone with hepatitis D get prescribed that? And what are the side effects?
That's a good question. As I mentioned, pegylated interferon alpha is not approved for the treatment of hepatitis delta anywhere in the world, including the United States. Pegylated interferon alpha 2A is approved in the United States under the brand name Pegasus for the treatment of chronic hepatitis B. Many patients with hepatitis B used to be treated with pegylated interferon alpha. The number has dropped after the advent of third generation nucleotide analogs such as entecavir, tenofovir disoproxyl fumarate, and tenofovir alafenamide more recently. Nonetheless, there are patients who are treated. I do not know how many patients with Delta are treated with pegylated interferon alpha, but what I can tell you anecdotally, speaking with hepatologists who have an interest in Delta, many of them will have provided their patients with a course of pegylated interferon alpha. The response rates, as we talked about, are modest, and interferons have a number of adverse effects. In particular, flu-like symptoms. The patients will feel some muscle aches, they may have chills, low-grade fever, headaches, there may be some degree of alopecia, nothing compared with nothing remotely compared with what you would see in a patient undergoing chemotherapy for cancer, and a number of other less common effects. So flu-like symptoms would be high on the would be the highest ones on the list.
Thank you very much. So for our second question, would you think that the expansion of Medicaid or an increase in insured patients in the U.S. is influencing the increase in hepatitis D that we're seeing?
It's a very good question. I do not, the research that we did does not provide the answer specifically to this question. However, if we take into account that a large number of patients became insured, it is conceivable that more patients were tested and more patients diagnosed. Because in the end of the day, it's access to healthcare and the ability to afford tests that are not necessarily cheap. So I can only speculate on that. The second possibility is that awareness is increasing. You know, online CME programs, it's much easier to get CME these days. There are multiple ways, multiple venues, multiple opportunities. So it's probably a combination of factors, but I don't think the access to health care can be underestimated. But again, this is, at this moment, speculative. Our data did not go that far.
Absolutely. What drugs are in the pipeline for HDV now, and when might they come and be available in the U.S.?
The last question I cannot address for a fact because one, I have a conflict of interest, of course, and two, I cannot speak on behalf of regulatory agencies. There are drugs that are being developed for Delta. At IGER, we are developing an oral drug called lonafarnib, and what lonafarnib does, it impacts the human enzyme that is used by the Delta virus to bind to the hepatitis B surface antigen and then be secreted out of the hepatocyte and infect other cells. We are also testing a different type of interferon lambda, and studies with both drugs are ongoing. There is a company in Canada called Replicor, and they are testing a class of compounds called nucleic acid polymers. And although the mechanism of action is not entirely clear, in part, it appears to be related to the mechanisms of surface antigen secretion by hepatocytes. They are in phase 2 as well. There is a third company called MER GHMB / Heptera. This is a company it's a joint company in Germany and Russia, and they are in phase 2 testing Mercludex B. And Mercludex is a drug that prevents the hepatitis B virus and the hepatitis D virus from uninfected hepatocytes. They are in phase 2 in combination with either tenofovir or pegylated interferon. There are some other drugs that are intended to be tested in Delta, but not there yet. I cannot say again, how soon would the drug be available? What I can tell you is that all companies developing compounds for Delta are working as fast as we and they can to try, if successful, to bring a drug to the market.
Thank you. So we do have a few more questions.
Sure.
Someone is asking if hepatitis delta specific drugs should be the focus, or if an hepatitis B cure, how that would affect hepatitis delta.
It's the latter. If you cure hepatitis B, and I'm going to say clinical cure, but if a patient loses surface antigen, you cannot have detectable hepatitis delta. This is the reality for the majority of patients. Delta depends on the surface antigen. So if we are able to cure hepatitis B, we are curing Delta at the same time. And along the same lines, of course, the most important thing that we can do about hepatitis B is vaccinate people. The vaccine is easy to give, is the best vaccine known to mankind. The response rate is phenomenal. It's close to 100% in neonates. And it is the first vaccine to prevent cancer, hepatocellular carcinoma in that case. And of course, if you're vaccinated, you don't acquire hepatitis B. By definition, you do not acquire Delta. Back to B-Cure, there are a very large number of companies testing many different classes of compounds trying to cure hepatitis B. It is a tall order, but it's very good to see that a lot of time and effort and resources are being put into it.
Great, thank you. Is it possible for liver enzymes to remain normal when someone is co-infected with Delta and hepatitis B, especially if
yes.
hepatitis Delta is more aggressive?
Yes, it is. Like in chronic hepatitis B, enzymes fluctuate as well. And I can tell you, we are running studies for Delta, and we did have patients who failed at screening because of normal liver enzymes. And these were patients that in the past had documented in the clinics that were treating them abnormal enzymes. So fluctuations do occur like in hepatitis B. So an important thing for either one of the two diseases is normal enzymes today are not equivalent to normal enzymes a month from now. So following those patients up is very, very important.
Right. So we'll take one more question. So what are the benefits of screening for patients and providers if there's only one current treatment?
Well, the first benefit, of course, is if there is a willingness to provide a course of treatment for the patient. This is one thing. The second thing is you can also identify close relatives, household members. So being aware of the disease is important because it also increases the risk of evolution to cirrhosis and liver cancer. So these patients need to be monitored carefully. So it's not only treatment, but also patient follow-up. The follow-up needs to be a little more aggressive as well to see, hopefully not, but to see ahead of time when complications may occur.
Definitely makes sense. So that's all the questions we're going to take for today. If your question did not get answered, feel free to email it to us after the webinar. And thank you so much, Dr. Martins, for your rich answers to these questions, and we're really happy to have you on today.
No, the pleasure was all mine, and I want to thank the Hepatitis B Foundation for this opportunity, and I want to thank all that dialed in for taking time out of your busy days, and I hope we were able to shed a little bit of light on this complex disease. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So for everyone still on the line, please remember to fill out the post-webinar survey, and it also includes opportunities for patients and providers to receive more information about upcoming clinical trials. And also look out for a message from us, which will include more materials from today's webinar. And also don't forget to visit us on our website and check us out on social media. We would greatly appreciate your feedback on that survey. As you exit, please feel free to fill that out. And thank you again so much for everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day.